Ecology and Conservation Lab here in SAS, and let's dive right into it. So, to start off, riparian habitat is referring to this terrestrial habitat that occurs around the edges of water bodies like rivers, streams, and lakes. It's usually super lush in vegetation and high in nutrients with high biodiversity, and a lot of species really depend on this habitat for survival. This is an example of one of the sites that I sampled in my capstone, super lush vegetation here. And some species rely on this riparian habitat so much that they are deemed as riparian obligate species. And what that means is that they basically depend on this riparian habitat at some point in life history for a large part of their survival and reproduction. So for birds specifically, this could mean that they need riparian habitat for nesting, roosting, feeding, breeding. And a huge part of these riparian ecosystems comes from these aquatic insect communities that live in the streams. These aquatic insects bring this massive influx of aquatic nutrients up into terrestrial ecosystems. It kind of combats that gravity-induced sinkage of nutrients into aquatic ecosystems by emerging out of the water and contributing to the food web of terrestrial habitats. So a lot of birds really rely on these guys to emerge as adults successfully, and so they can come swoop in and eat them during the summer months here in Puget Sound. So a problem occurs with urbanization. Urbanization has a lot of physical effects on streams. It can increase temperatures, disrupt the flow regimes, add a lot of contaminants and nutrients into the water that will mess with these aquatic insect communities. It makes them less diverse. It will kill off all the intolerant species and leave only some tolerant taxa left. It lowers emergence success rates, so a lot of insects won't survive to become adults and actually emerge as winged things that the birds will come and eat. And it also can alter the timing of the emergences. So like if temperature were to increase, they might emerge earlier in the year, and then by the time the birds come around to swoop and eat them, they've already peaked in emergence, and it creates this phenological mismatch that's pretty bad for the birds. So our research question that we derived from this is we want to know how the integrity of these aquatic insects are affecting riparian obligate bird species richness, and also how the level of urbanization is affecting riparian obligate species richness as well. So these are the main pathways that we're going to be looking into. We want to know the direct effects that insects have on species richness, the direct effects that urbanization has on species richness, as well as the indirect effects that urbanization has on species richness via this indirect pathway by affecting the insect community's effect on riparian obligate bird species richness. So our hypothesis for these is that we were guessing that urbanization was going to have negative effects both directly and indirectly on riparian obligate bird species richness. We were guessing that insect integrity was going to have a positive effect on species richness. And we also threw vegetation land cover into this model because we have the data for it, and it also will help explain some more variance and make our model a better fit for all of the different ecological variables that there are in a model like this. So how do you test these relationships? And there's so many independent variables that all have relationships with each other, and the dependent variable, you can do something called a structural equation model, or an SEM model. And these models evaluate multivariate causal relationships, so it will allow us to examine all the direct and indirect relationships between all of the different variables. It'll tell us the strength and direction of the relationships, as well as whether or not our model is a good fit or not, or if we're missing some variables that we don't have data for, which could be literally anything that affects the ecosystem, like noise pollution or type of vegetation, could be anything. So in order to perform these, we used R. And we did two SEM models, one for total species richness and then one focusing in just on riparian obligate species richness. The reason why we did the total species one is that we wanted something to compare the riparian obligate one to, so it's acting as a nice reference nice reference numbers for us to compare to. So in order to gather all the data for all these different relationships, we took 30 different sites that King County has been sampling for insect integrity, all within King County. And we showed along a gradient from more urbanized areas out into pristine areas. So these are two of the example sites that we have here. One is very close to a road with busy cars going by, that's more urban, and one's more out away from the urbanized Seattle areas, more pristine. Some of them were out behind gas station parking lots, super urban, and other ones required hiking to get to. So really big gradient for urbanization. To gather the aquatic insect health, King County has a database called the Puget Sound Stream Benthos. This is where they upload all their aquatic insect data into for all of the sites that we chose from. And they give them a score based off their benthic index of biotic integrity, or BIBI. And this scoring system is basically assigned whether or not there are intolerant taxa present, how diverse the insect communities are, how the levels of larvae in the water. This the success of the emergences. And then all of our sites were chosen based off a gradient of VIVI as well. So we have ranges from all the way to like excellent insect conditions to very poor insect conditions all across King County. And then for our urbanization and vegetation measurements, we used a land cover spatial data set. It's a 3-foot terrestrial land cover data set. And we used ArcGIS to examine this. We created 100-meter buffers around each of our 30 sites. That's what the buffers look like. And then classified the land cover within these 100-meter buffers. Our impervious surfaces, which are like concrete and paved surfaces, are acting as our metric for urbanization. And then we also got vegetation land cover from these buffers as well. These different categories from pristine to non-supporting are how impervious surfaces impact ecologically relevant metrics of streams. So like once you get to non-supporting 26% to 100% impervious surface streams, that's when like the stream is really disrupted and things are really starting to take effect of urbanization. So we have a gradient of there as well from a lot of non-supporting streams to some more pristine things and everything in between. And then for species richness data, we went out to all of these 30 different sites and set up a microphone in each one. They're called AudioMoth autonomous recording units. They're all tied to a tree as close as possible to where King County measured the aquatic insect health. And we set these to record between 4 a.m. and 11 a.m. and then again from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. And this kind of represents the most vocal hours of the day when birds are active because it's just dawn and dusk. And then the reason why you set a recording schedule like that is because you want to save battery, because that's kind of what mainly limits bioacoustic surveys like this. So just focusing in on the hours of the day when birds are vocal will allow the battery to last longer. We deployed these in mid-June, and then the battery died around mid-August, so we've got around 2 months of data to work with. So the way you deal with all of those hundreds of hours of raw audio files is that you can give it to this neural network model called BirdNet, and BirdNet will basically take in all of these raw dot wave files and start spitting out predictions of what it thinks the bird is. And in order for that to work, you have to give it a species list for birds to choose from. So I created a species list using 3 years of Cornell Labs eBird community science observations. eBird is basically just a database where bird watchers upload observations of birds they've seen. So I took 3 years of that data for King County during the months that we sampled and created a species list with that. Gave all the species to BirdNet to say like, hey, these are the species we want you to look out for. And then I'll take all those dot wave files and start saying like, I'm pretty sure I'm seeing such and such species here. Just make sure the model is doing all this correctly because it's not always 100% right. I went in and manually verified 2 samples of each of the species that it thinks it saw. And how to do that is you look at the spectrogram right here. This is an example of a Wilson's warbler call. So you can look at the range of frequency, how long the call is, the spacing in between each of the chirps, and then compare that to reference spectrograms of the same species to see if that really is a species you think you are, if there's a similar one with a similar call. That's a good way to differentiate between the two. So now that we have all of those different data, we can plug that back into our SCN model, and we get results that start to look like this. These dashed arrows are non-statistically significant pathways. These solid arrows are, this one solid arrow is statistically significant. Our one statistically significant pathway is impervious surfaces effect on VIVI. And just to give you some ideas of what these numbers actually mean, because they don't always just mean correlation, what it's really telling you is how strongly and in what direction one variable affects another. So for example, if urbanization were to increase by 1 standard deviation, it would lead to a 0.494 decreased standard deviation in VIVI. It does not always mean significance, which you can see here. This is the only one that was truly significant. And it also tells us wellness of fit of our model. This model explains 35% of the variation in the species richness, which isn't great. That means we're missing a lot of variables from the ecosystem, which makes sense for an ecological state like this. We have all sorts of things happening from urbanization and little birds and little streams happening. And so an interesting result of this total species richness model, so this isn't just focusing in on riparian obligate, this is total species richness, is that urbanization had a positive effect on total species richness. And this could be because there's a lot of suburban and urban species here in King County, like robins, starlings, house sparrows that aren't necessarily native species that are great for the ecosystems. So species like that could be messing with total species richness here in the total model. But what's interesting is when you narrow it down to riparian obligate species richness, we see that number decrease quite a bit. This model explained slightly more of the variation in species richness at 47%. And then when you start comparing these numbers to the total between total bird species richness and riparian obligate bird species richness, we see that urbanization went from a positive number to a negative number. We saw a slightly stronger relationship in the indirect pathway that urbanization had through BIBI, and we also saw a more direct, strong relationship between BIBI and bird species richness as well. So just giving those numbers again, these are the three relationships that were most interesting to us. And yes, so we're seeing stronger negative relationships from urbanization on riparian obligate bird species richness, and we're also seeing more stronger positive relationship between BIBI and riparian obligate bird species richness when compared to the total species richness in general. So just some interpretations of what that could mean. Is that riparian obligate species could be relying more on aquatic insect availability. They could be more directly negatively affected by urbanization, and both directly and indirectly through that BIBI pathway. And why this really matters is because riparian habitat is being threatened by urbanization. Removes a lot of native vegetation and disrupts that stream flow, and that leads to riparian obligate birds experiencing more widespread population declines when compared to other bird species. So a lot of these riparian obligate birds, like this willow flycatcher here, are more of conservational concern. So effective conservation management is going to be needed to target both the direct and indirect pathway that was identified in this capstone on the effects on riparian obligate birds. So some cool method you could do to do that, if you wanted to do that, is this King County bug seeding project, is where they are going out to streams and transplanting aquatic communities from healthy, diverse streams into more urbanized streams, which was being found to increase that BIBI score. And this helps the insects kind of get around the blockages that urbanization creates that might prevent them from coming from one stream to another. So doing this strategy might be a good way to integrate into your riparian obligate bird species conservation strategy, along with the traditional method of stream restoration, where you go in and remove non-native vegetation, replace with native vegetation. Tackling both the direct and indirect pathways will be super important to conserve riparian obligate birds. And that is the biggest takeaway is focusing on indirect and the direct pathways that urbanization has on these riparian obligate bird species. And yeah, that is it. Yes.
Yeah, so I learned more about riparian obligate birds than I had ever before, so thank you for that. What is, as a complete novice ornithologist, what does your species richness look like for the riparian obligates overall? Is there 5 species, or is there hundreds that streams?
There's not that. It ranged from a lot of sites had 0 riparian obligates show up, and I think the highest one was 6, with an average of 2 or 3. So it's not super abundant in King County. So.
And the non-riparian was much higher than that?
Yeah, the non-riparian is over 20 or 30.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Stephen, this is so cool, and I'm wondering if you sampled a variety of stream borders in your site, or if they were similar, and if you have any hypotheses of how your results would change based on a smaller stream or a larger stream or river.
Yeah, definitely. Some of the streams, I feel weren't even really streams. They were kind of it was really hard to see them. They're completely covered or buried at some point. I don't know how King County sampled some of these. They've got a lot of bushwhacking to get to. And then some of the streams were super wide and large. If I had to guess, I'm assuming larger streams it might be more a matter of the substrate of it, in case that's really important for insect larvae to grow. So it might have to decide for more substrate and water quality. And also, if it's a larger stream, it might be taking in more contaminants from urbanization, maybe. Maybe you'd see a decrease there. So, I don't know, maybe.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.